starting with the great name of Allah, who is the most merciful and the most compassionate. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss about the poetry, which is a category of literature. Basically, literature has three main categories. The first one is poetry, the second one is drama, and the third one is prose. In today's lecture, we are going to cover some of the aspects of poetry. That what is poetry, what is the definition of poetry, what is the historical background of poetry, along with some explanation and its types. So, going towards the definition of poetry, I would like to pop up the historical background of poetry. Poetry perhaps predates other forms of literature, but the early known record includes this. But the early poetry perhaps predates other forms of literature, but early recorded history include the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, which is dated round about 3000 BC, which is an allusion to the biblical story of Bible. And according to this story, the whole earth has been destroyed by flood. So this is the first recorded history in the field of poetry. The second example in the recorded history is the works of Homer, that is the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad and the Odyssey, these works are culture based and primarily based on the oral traditions, but still they have the mnemonic functions in the current situations. This was all about the history of English literature. Now we are going towards the definition of poetry, that what are the basic definitions of poetry. So the general definition of poetry is that poetry is imaginative and emotional interpretation of life. It is very clear definition and there is no need of its explanation. The second definition is that poetry deals with the facts, experiences and problems of life. So as I have already told you in the previous lecture that literature is the actual picture of life. So in this way, poetry is a part of literature and literature deals with life. So we can say that poetry deals with the facts, definitions proposed by the prominent writers of English literature. Among them, the first definition has been provided by S.T. Coleridge, Samuel Charlie Coleridge, who is a romantic poet and who has a major contribution in the history of English literature. According to him, poetry is the antithesis of science. According to this definition, science believes in the physical existence of a thing, while poetry is the assumed one. So, in this way, poetry is the antithesis of science. The second definition that has been provided to us is by Carlyle. According to Carlyle, poetry is the breath and finest spirit of all knowledge. The third definition is given by William Wordsworth, and this definition is most widely used in the world of English literature. According to William Wordsworth, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Then we have another definition provided by Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a very prominent writer of English literature who has contributed in creating the English dictionary for the first time in the history of English literature. So he also have the credit of English dictionary. According to him, poetry is a metrical composition. This definition will be explained later on in the explanation of poetry. The last definition has been given by Matthew Arnold, who is known as the father of modern criticism. According to Matthew Arnold, poetry is the part of literature and literature is the criticism of life. So it is very obvious in the light of the previous lectures that literature is a criticism of life. So basically literature is the commentation over life. It is the representation of life as it is. So in this way, poetry is a part of literature. So we can say that poetry is the commentation and criticism of life. These were all about the definitions of poetry. Now we are heading towards the explanation of poetry. Poetry is a composition of usually written in verse, and poetry relies heavily on imagery, choice of precise words, and metaphors. They may take the form of measures consisting of patterns of stress. We can say that stress and unstressed patterns are syllables, or the patterns of different length syllables, as we can find in the classic writing. Sometimes they may or may not utilize a rhyme. One cannot readily characterize poetry precisely. Typically, though, poetry as a form of literature makes some significant use of the formal properties of words it uses, the properties attached to written or spoken form of the words rather than their meaning. And the meter depends on the syllables and on rhymes of speech. Rhyme and alliteration depends on words that have similar pronunciation. And some recent poets, such as E. Cummings, made extensive use of words in his poetry, and the basic technique in his writing is he used the words to give us the visual form. So this was all about explanation of poetry. Now we are going towards the different types of poetry. In poetry, we have two main types. The first one is subjective poetry, and the second one is objective poetry. Subjective poetry. Subjective poetry is also known as personal poetry or lyrical poetry. In subjective poetry, the poet goes down into himself and finds subjects in its passions, feelings, and emotions. The writer writes for himself, not for the other. The second type is objective poetry. Objective poetry is that poetry in which the writer goes out of itself and finds the emotions, feelings, and all the sensation and outside of the world. The best examples of objective poetry are ballads, dramatic poetries, dramatic plays, etc. So, this was all about the poetry. The forms of poetry will be discussed in the next video, inshallah. So, stay connected with us and learn a lot. Thank you.